something that's encouraging to you. Hopefully it's something where you can sort of catch up and see what's happening. And if you've got questions that you want to ask, we want to be able to help with those. I did get a question ahead of time that somebody asked me, and was kind of saying maybe, Joe, I'm not totally sure that I agree with you on partake in the book of Revelation. And so we had a good discussion about that. If you go to Revelation and you want to follow along in your Bibles, let me show you what this particular person was asking me about. Revelation, over to chapter 14, which is what we studied last Sunday morning in the adult class. And in this chapter of 14, it starts out with 144,000, and they're there with the Lamb, who is Christ. And there's a discussion happening here that the angel is, taking John and showing him some different things. And then John starts to see different angels flying. If you go down to verse 6, verse 7, verse 8. And there's a concept in verse 8 that says, a second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Now that's pretty interesting. And Babylon was actually not a kingdom at the time that Revelation was written. So what possibly could this be about? Why would the angel say, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great? Well, what you have to remember when you're reading the book of Revelation in particular is that the type of writing found here is what's called apocalyptic writing. That means writing about the end of the world. And the two other books that are the most similar stylistically to the book of Revelation would be the book of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel. So a lot of what you see referenced in Revelation is actually coming from pictures that these people, many of them who had been Jews before they became Christians, would be well acquainted with, understanding Daniel and Ezekiel from teaching that they had had probably since they were young. So he's going to commonly, here in Revelation, the angel's going to say these kind of things. John's going to say these kind of things. We're going to see messages like this, even from Jesus as he speaks in the book of Revelation, that reference concepts that are pictures from Old Testament apocalyptic books, primarily Daniel and Ezekiel, though we also see a little bit from places like Isaiah as well. Well, fallen is Babylon the Great. Interestingly enough, Daniel talks about Babylon because Daniel actually existed in the time that Babylon was a kingdom on the earth. And so it would make your mind think back, if you were a Jew, back to the time of Daniel. And you would quickly go back and read Daniel to understand some of these things. So it then goes on to say, don't worship the beast. And as we've studied recently, we just studied it yesterday here, about Daniel and his prophecy regarding King Nebuchadnezzar turning into a beast because he wasn't following what God said or honoring God or looking up to God. And so because he wasn't doing those things, there was a prophecy that said you will eventually end up turning into this beast. You will be separated from your people. You will go out for a period of 7 times, which we assume was probably 7 years. It's possible some suggest could be 7 months. But whatever the time period was, he was separated from his people. He wasn't allowed to be with people because he acted like an animal. He crawls around on all fours. He's eating, grass from the field. And so that picture of the beast, the king turning into a beast literally and acting like a beast, is a picture that they would have been well acquainted with knowing the book of Daniel. Well, it brings a question up when you go back to Revelation 14. If it's not Babylon that he's talking about literally, what is it talking about? We would assume a nation. We would assume a powerful country in the world. And the only country that I can think of, or that history would show us, was as powerful in terms of how large it covered and how many different places it had conquered, that would compare to Babylon in the time of Daniel would be Rome, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was huge by the time that we see Revelation 14 written. And so it's very logical that many would historically say if there's a reference to Babylon in Revelation, but it's not talking about Babylon literally back in the book of Daniel, then it could very readily be talking to us about Rome. And of course, Rome would have access to this letter as it circulated the churches, so it could be dangerous to say Rome if you actually meant Rome. Rome would pick that up and would destroy those. But Babylon sounds like it refers to the Old Testament, but the Jews who had become Christians would understand there is a similarity there. They're using like and as sort of comparisons to help people understand, okay, I see what he's talking about. Well, if Babylon is Rome, which I think is reasonable to assume, who would the great leader of Babylon then be? It's not Nebuchadnezzar, right? That wouldn't make sense. So, for that reason, it's logical for us to say, well, who was the head of Rome at this time? Now, in class on Sunday, I referenced that many believe that the beast here referred to is Nero Caesar. All right, another problem presents itself. If we assume that the beast in chapter 14 not to worship is Nero Caesar, because Nero Caesar was dead by the time this letter circulated based on everything that we know. However, there was a very popular idea, a myth, that was begun and actually circulated during the time of Nero, that if he did ever die, if anything should ever happen to him, which frequently happened to Caesars, often by their own people, their hand, if something should happen to Nero, you should still fear Nero because he said he was a god. And for that reason, he would say, well, a god you can't kill. A god can come back from apparently what looks like the dead, and he can rule again. Interesting. He's suggesting the concept of resurrection, and Nero had this myth circulated that that would apply to him. And so there were many after the death of Nero, with the continuation of the imperial cult by the other evil emperors, that Nero still existed. He hadn't actually truly died, and he could come back whenever he wanted. So there were a lot of people in Rome and in the cultures and societies that were affected by Rome that still had a very fearful concept of Nero and who he was. And so I think this concept of the beast doesn't use a particular man's name. I think it could be that they're all thinking of Nero, but it doesn't have to be Nero. So I don't want you to think that, well, Joe said it was Nero and that's what it means. No, I don't believe that. But I do believe, when you go back and look in chapter 13, we used this, and I'd be happy to share it with you. If you have a question about it, ask me. We used in the end of chapter 13, verse 18, it tells us who the man is, and it says, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and that number is 666. And we talked about that number, 666. Is that a fearful number? Should I not have a computer because the number 666 might come up, or there might be some sort of an issue if that number happens, or if I count to that number, am I doing something demonic? No, I don't believe that's what it's saying here. I think it's using numbers as figures to help us calculate something. Now, when you calculate something, you don't just look at the number. That wouldn't be calculating. So they were using a table called a geometric table. Gematria is what this is called. And there was a Hebrew as well as a Roman geometric table. And that geometric table, if you take the number 666, it actually spells out Nero Caesar. So I think there's a looking back to Nero, the power of Nero, and I think the fact that Nero called himself God. I think that was the great sin of Nero as it relates to, him becoming the beast. He tried to assert that he was God and that people should worship him. And he set up, historically, what we can even read about, not just from the Bible, he set up the imperial cult. And the imperial cult did a lot of harm, threatened to kill people, and did end up killing people who would not worship the emperor or bow to him. And we know that in the time of these evil emperors, that the imperial cult became very, very powerful. And the lead priest of the imperial cult was some say almost as powerful, if not more powerful, than the emperor, because he could declare that you wouldn't worship the emperor and then you would be killed. And a lot of Christians died during this period, which, if you go back to Revelation, the first few chapters, you read about the 7 churches. These people who would be willing to go to death because of their faith, their belief in God, those people are called overcomers in those first few letters to those churches. So, I tried to, in a long-winded way, which I don't know, I'm a preacher. I don't know another way to do it, but I tried to help answer that question. Why do I believe that there's a reference in chapters 13 and 14 to Nero Caesar? Why do I think Babylon is Rome? And that's my justification for that. But, as I said, I don't want to stand here and say, well, that's what it has to be and it can't be anything else. I don't want to do that. There's a lot of revelation that has potential multiple or different interpretations, and I want to be careful as we walk through Revelation and do that. The reason we're studying Revelation, and I'll tell you that now, is because it really represents the end of our focus of our study from last year, our theme for the year, which was the name above all names, which is Jesus. And we're studying Revelation with the intent to see Jesus throughout the book of Revelation. So our reason, and if you've been following our study, you'll see some weeks we skip around. We don't just go one chapter to the next chapter. And the reason we don't is because we're not just trying to handle the entirety of the book of Revelation. We're actually trying to see Christ in the book of Revelation, which is why this week we studied chapter 19. And chapter 19 deals heavily with Jesus and who he is and what he would do for his people and how he would come and he would honor his people, and there would be this wedding supper of the Lamb, which in chapter 19 is contrasted with the great supper of God, which is not something you would want to be a part of. The wedding supper of the Lamb would be exciting. You would be there with Jesus. You would be honored. You'd be in a great position. You'd be able to have that proximity and closeness, that intimacy, so to speak, with Christ, because you have this great relationship with him. But if you don't choose Christ, if you don't honor God, if you don't worship the true and living God, then your other option is to worship the beast. And in chapter 19, if you worship this beast, Jesus ultimately is going to be coming for you. There is a judgment moment happening. It talks about Christ in chapter 19 of Revelation. And he comes, it says in the second half of 11, verse 11, he comes with justice, and he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. Now that's interesting. That references back to the Jesus we see in Revelation chapter 1. And often I will call him Judgment Jesus there in Revelation chapter 1. I think that stands up. I think that's good. And we see Jesus here judging between those who's going to worship him and who's going to worship the beast. If you're worshiping him, you get invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb, and that sounds exciting. A wedding supper. There'll be food there, there'll be celebration. You get to be with the one who's, wedded to his church in this case. That is the bride of Christ. We know that from passages in Revelation, but also places like Ephesians chapter 5, who calls the church the bride of Christ. And so there's good justification for saying, hey, that is the church, the wedding feast of the Lamb, the wedding supper of the Lamb. That's where we're invited, those who love Jesus and follow him. Yes? Awesome. Revelation 14, I don't see it, Jake, so... All right, let's read this. So let's go to Revelation 14, and we'll read starting in verse 9. Moses is asked a question about who are the people that are referenced here in this passage. Am I understanding that right, Jake? Okay. So it says, the third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. That doesn't sound like a good place to be. So yes, we definitely want to figure out how we cannot be counted among that group of people or in that number. That would be a really good thing to figure out and understand. So, as we stop and think about that and sort of consider what he's talking about here, there's two groups of people. The first group of people in the beginning of chapter 14 are these who are approved of by God. Now that's selected. They're selected or are called out by a number, in this case 144,000, which is 12 times 12,000, which is a number that equals perfection. And so I believe that's those people who belong to God. It calls them the first fruits to God and the Lamb. And they're right, they're righteous people. That's a powerful concept to think about. Just a second here, I'm trying to get everything lined up so I can see this. So when we stop and think about that, there's a differentiation between these two groups of people. Either you're these righteous people that are approved of by God, or you are the negative people, the people who haven't been listening, paying attention, worshiping God. You've been worshiping the beast. And if you've been worshiping the beast, that's going to put you in a very, very negative light. It's going to put you in a position where he says you're going to have a mark, an indication. Now, some people used to take this very literally. There's going to be some sort of a mark. There's going to be some sort of a visible thing on these people. I don't believe that that's what it is telling us. I think it's telling us that God's going to understand who are his and who are not his. And so, because God's going to see that, God will be able to distinguish who belong to him and who don't. That'd be very comforting for the early Christians, because it'd be really easy for them to stop and think, wow, how do I know that I'm right before God? How do I know that God approves of me? That would be a challenging thing for people to stop and think about. But in this case, they are being told you're either part of this chosen number that he knows, and he knows you, or you're part of the negative number, those who have worshiped the beast, who haven't done what God said, who have this image on you. I don't think it's a physical image. I think it's a concept that God can number who are his and who are not. All right, 2 seconds. I'm going to try to get in here so I can see this chat. All right, I'm working on it. See, you're learning with me while we're going here, and I appreciate that. All right. Good. Well, okay. Good. Any other questions, Jake, that you see? Okay. Good. We will keep going. So, hopefully that helps, and Moses, hopefully that helped answer your question about that. I want to pop back over to chapter 19 so that we can see that thought that I was mentioning there, which is that if you don't get invited to back in chapter 19, verse 7, the wedding supper of the Lamb, then you get invited to another feast. And actually, you're not the one feasting. You're the one being feasted upon. Jesus comes with his armies. Jesus, his robe is dipped in blood. Everybody else is there. Is white. They're covered with white, clean linen. And then they make war against all those who would not worship God or who did, in fact, worship the beast. And it says, starting in verse 17 of chapter 19, I saw an angel standing in the sun who cried in a loud voice to all the birds flying in midair, come together for the great supper of God, so you can eat the flesh of kings, generals, and the mighty, of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, great and small. I see it, Abel Johnson. I see Abel Johnson. It's coming through now. Thank you, Abel, for paying attention and asking a question here in the app. Abel Johnson says, who are the 24 elders? Great question, Abel. Now, we don't have a great explanation of who the 24 elders are. And elders get mentioned in heaven several times, which is a really interesting concept, that even in the church we have elders. We know that. That is a biblical teaching coming from 1 Timothy, as well as a couple of other places. And there's a reference to elders then also who are, in heaven. So there's elders in heaven. And the 24 elders, a lot of people suggest, and I think there's some possible credibility here, would be 12 representing the 12 tribes, the heads of the 12 tribes, the men who are the 12 sons of Jacob, who would represent the 12 tribes, and 12 from the 12 apostles in the New Testament. And so it's figurative, 24 being the perfect. It's from the old, it's from the new. 12 from Israel, 12 from the New Testament. So you got 12 from the Old Testament, Israel, and 12 from the New Testament. So that's always made a lot of sense to me, and I think there's every reason to think that that is something that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Moses says he wants to clarify. He wants to go back to chapter 14. Chapter 14, and he wants to ask about 19, verse 19. So I mistook his question there. All right, chapter 14, 19, verse 19. It says, "The angel swung a sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and the blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia." Well, it does sound like, I would say, just in general terms, that this sounds like a case of judgment. So the sickle being the threshing, right, concept. So he would cut these things down, and he would press them, and it's God's fury, the winepress of God's fury, not a place you would want to be. It's not the winepress of God's wrath, so we would see that as a negative thing. And yes, I would see that as something negative occurring there, Moses, that those people are the people who were not obedient to God, who fought against God or his people, who did not, treat God as who he is, and very well could include those who were worshiping the beast, as it talks about earlier in that chapter. All right, good. These are good questions you guys are asking. Let's go back to Daniel and look at Daniel for just a minute. You got your Old Testaments there with you. I like to explore a little bit and look at Daniel, because Daniel is such a powerful book, and we're not through with some of the great and awesome stories in the book of Daniel. I do have people looking ahead and asking me questions in church here or after church about what's coming later in the book of Daniel. I will say this, the last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel are pretty tough. They're pretty tough sledding in terms of interpretation and handling that, in terms of the prophecy that Daniel is dealing with. And there is a lot of different opinions about what those 3 chapters are. I may or may not get to those in my preaching, simply because some of those chapters don't preach very smoothly. They're pretty hard chapters to preach. And so, the preacher might take a pass and might handle some of the easier stories in the book of Daniel. But so far, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 have been great. They're great stories. One of my favorite books just to read, if I'm just going to read a chapter or two, is Daniel, because these stories flow so well. They're so awesome. They have a clear hero. They have a clear anti-hero, right? An antagonist who is frequently pushing against the hero, who won't honor God. And so in this case, it happens to be the king. And Daniel never is going to become the king in an inferior people, who don't worship and honor God. They are idolatrous people. They're not ever going to hold God as their king. Therefore, they're not ever going to have one of God's people as their king. And so because of that, Daniel never is going to step up to that role, though we think, based on the book of Daniel, that he lives a long and healthy life. He goes through a great deal of trial and difficulty, but he does live and work a long time as a prophet for God. I'm going to go check Facebook real quick and make sure nobody has asked any questions there and see. Not so far. Okay, good. So, when you go through Daniel and you look at each of these chapters, what you'll see is that Daniel is growing as the understanding, as the judgments of God come through. Daniel grows, it seems like each time, in terms of his position within the kingdom. That reminds me a lot, always when I read Daniel, it reminds me of another Old Testament character who started in a low position, but then kept coming up and rising up. Started as a servant, ends up becoming a very powerful man in the kingdom, which is Joseph. I'm sure you were all saying that at the same time, screaming at your app or television. It's Joseph. Yes, it is Joseph. And so Daniel is reflective of that a man who will be faithful to God. And Daniel interprets dreams. Joseph interpreted dreams as well. So it's amazing how similar Joseph and Daniel are. And that shows us, I think, one of the things that God often does with His Word, which makes the Bible such a powerful book. He will use logical, very discernible patterns that you're able to pick up on and go, wait a minute, that's reminding me of something else. And the Bible will do that a lot. As you study it more, you'll see more and more of those little, I call them kind of winks. It's kind of like a wink from God. Hey, do you see that? And then it makes you realize, hey, I can also study this other thing and learn from that as well. I can tie these two things together. And I think there's a real logical part of that that's happening when you're reading the book of Daniel. But you see him continue to step up. The reason we're calling it this part of the lesson series, Speaking Truth to Power. And the reason we're doing that is because he is not in power, although he ends up in a much more powerful position. But Daniel is always subservient to a king who doesn't honor God as the one and only true and living God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar will even say that a few times, and at the end of chapter 4, he gets the closest we see any of these idolatrous kings get of really saying that he is God above everything. And he really does say that in the end of chapter 4. Unfortunately for us, we don't have the history of what else happened after that in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, at least not from Scripture, because Nebuchadnezzar is going to go away, and the next chapter is going to pick up Belshazzar, which is the next king, who is his son. So, it's pretty interesting that we don't have the rest of the picture there. But we do see some powerful things happening. Chapter 1, a refusal to do what he's told, and he says, I'm not going to follow these practices of the culture that I'm a part of. Boy, that should be something we could learn from always. Chapter 2, he sees this dream and what's happening here and interprets the dream for the king. And it's a powerful picture of the visions of the next kingdoms that are coming. And the king hears this, and the king is excited about it because he finds out that he's the head of gold in this statue of a man that is seen. And so Daniel is actually talking about prophecy that leads far into the future that this king would not live to see. But this king, as kings want to do, wants to use that to elevate himself. So he builds a statue, much like the man that he's told in his dream that he was seeing. And yet, in his statue, it's not all the different parts. The whole thing is gold. Why? Well, because it's all Nebuchadnezzar. He's gold, and the whole thing is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. So he does that. Then he ends up, humbled by God once again, because he tells his people, you have to all worship me as God. You have to worship me as this great and powerful idol. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not do it. And so because they won't do it, he throws them in the fiery furnace, but they live. And in there, he saw a fourth character, a fourth man. And as he sees that man, he realizes at some point This is not something that anybody could do. But what I love about always in that chapter 3, is when you read what he says, I'm going to throw you in this furnace that I've set up, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? I love that because he gets the answer, what God? Not your God, not the gods that you serve, not these idols that you worship, but the true and living God will do that, and was able to do it, and did it. And I also love, and the great point that I think comes out of that chapter is, when he says to them, I'm going to do this to you, and who can save you? And they say, well, our God can save us. But even if he does not, I love that. I love that phraseology, because what it shows you that, and shows me that I need to be reminded of regularly, is when I read these Bible characters, they don't always know what's going to happen at the end of the story. They're not reading it out of a book, they're living it. And so because they're reading it, not reading it out of a book, and they don't know what's going to happen, they approach it confidently because of their faith, but they don't approach it confidently because they know exactly what's going to occur. They didn't. Even if he does not, represents that they weren't sure what the outcome would be, but either way, God would take care of them. And I think that's a powerful thing. Imagine facing whatever you happen to be going through in life, whether it be something medically that you're going through tonight, or something that's happening with your family, or some kind of turmoil, to say, well, God could save us from whatever this is coming at us right now. But even if he does not, meaning I don't know what God's going to do, and that's outcome I can't control. All I can control is my faith in God. So I think that's a powerful part of chapter 3. And then chapter 4, in this vision of a tree, is also powerful, because we see so much happening here with Daniel and his willingness to again go back to this king who he seems to care about and tell him a hard truth, say something that's tough for him to hear. I hope you're encouraged in your own life to do that with people that you care about. Daniel obviously cares about the king. He said, I wish this wasn't you that this prophecy was about. In chapter 4, verse 19, he says that. I wish it applied to your enemies and not to you. He doesn't like it that it's happening to Nebuchadnezzar, but he still follows through and says to him the challenging thing. And often we have to do that for people we care about. I wish this wasn't the case. I wish I could tell you that things were, different, but, you're going to have to change. You're going to have to repent of where you're at, which was what Nebuchadnezzar was told. And he was given a year to repent. He wasn't told he was given a year, but he was, and it ended up being a year before he, stood before God and said, hey, look at my powerful kingdom, and look how mighty and awesome I am. And then he's lowered to all fours and crawls like a beast and eats of the grass of the field until he finally acknowledges God. This is good. This is good. I appreciate your time tonight. Is there anybody else having any more questions about? Okay. Sure. Sure, there's a lot of good study tools out there, things that you can go and look up and read on. There are easily places where you could be misled on passages like Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation. So my warning here is be careful and read and try to understand the writer of those things, where they're coming from, what their view of the book of Revelation is. We talked about it from the beginning, but many people see Revelation as telling us that there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ coming back. It's going to be a physical reign on earth. He's going to go, many say, to Jerusalem and start back his kingdom there. If you're reading some commentary and it starts to tell you that, or it's basing that as the key to understanding the book of Revelation, I would tell you to challenge that. I would tell you I do not believe the book teaches that. I do not believe that Jesus, when he came to earth, didn't accomplish what he intended, or that mankind stopped him, or that he couldn't have started an earthly kingdom if that was his intention. But you have to remember, Jesus says things like, my kingdom is not of this world. Having said that, my first stop for everybody is always a great resource online called Bible Gateway. Bible Gateway is great because it is not commentary. It is just Scripture. And there's several different versions right there online, and you can click on the version you want to read, and you can compare it to a different version. So start with Scripture. When you see a reference in the book of Revelation that takes you back to Ezekiel or Daniel as a reference point for some of the imagery, go read and look up in Ezekiel and Daniel, and do your best then to try to understand that. One of the commentaries that's pretty good on a lot of things is called the Enduring Word. Enduring Word. If you just go and Google Enduring Word, you will see that commentary. And look that up. You can look it up by book, chapter, and verse. And most of the time, it's pretty good. But again, we have to always remember when we're reading somebody's words that we're getting a certain sort of concept. If you have more detailed questions, I also have one of my former students from years ago, Dr. Nathan Daly, prepared the notes that I use for the study of the book of Revelation. And he ended up finishing his doctorate at Claremont University in California, and has a master's in Hebrew from Brandeis in Boston. He's a smart guy. So I depend on smart people who do hard work to help me understand things a lot of times. And a lot of the teachings that I do from Revelation come from some of Nathan's in-depth studies and some of the details he's put together. So if you have questions, I'd also be happy to share pieces of Nathan's notes with you. They are copious notes. It is pretty deep. Some of it is textual criticism as well, so it's a little hard to read, but it's really well done, and that is what I use heavily. So, these are good questions. Anything else, Jacob, that you see popping up? All right, well, you're lucky if you're here tonight. I'm going to give you a little preview of what we're going to study on Sunday, and then I'll let you get back to what you were doing before this evening. Chapter 5, we're going to study this week, and it's the writing on the wall. You've heard that statement, right? Well, you better read the writing on the wall. And we say it about all kinds of things. Well, that is one of the many sayings that we have in our culture and in English language that come from the Bible. The writing on the wall is literally King Belshazzar, who is the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, who, talks about even his father here in the early part of the chapter. And as we read through it, they are, celebrating, and they're having some sort of great, get-together. We're going to read about that on Sunday. And a human hand appears out of nowhere and literally writes on the wall. And it has a very important message to tell this king. And this king goes looking, as kings do, as his father did, for who's going to tell me the meaning of what this is? And guess who he reaches out to try to understand it? Well, it's Daniel again. And so we're gonna be back looking at Daniel, and he's now serving a new king, and yet he still has to speak truth, say hard things to somebody who's probably not going to like it, and yet Daniel stands up and does that very thing. So I hope you'll come this week, bring a friend, somebody else, and tell them, hey, have you ever seen the writing on the wall? Well, come and we'll understand more about that saying on Sunday. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for participating and sending your questions. And I'll tell you this too, in weeks to come when we do this again, you can feel free to send questions ahead of time. You can text those to me. Most all of you have my phone number. If you don't, you can look it up on the website. It's right there. Or you can send them to me via Facebook, or you can send them via email. There's so many different ways to stay in touch with us at South Point. So glad that you're here. So glad that you're a part of our family. If you're watching from afar, we're glad to have you tonight. And if anything ever brings you to Kansas City, we'd love to have you come our way. Hope you have a great rest of the night. Look forward to seeing you this next weekend. God bless.